Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Serene Jones, the president of Union Theological Seminary, and on behalf of our Alumni Relations Office and all of us here at Union, we're really happy that you're with us here for this conversation, and we're happy for all the alums in particular that have been over the past week and into next week taking part in this year's Union at Home Fall Festival, which is filled with many events, of which this is a very important one. The pandemic may have pushed our reunion events online, but it didn't stop us from gathering. In fact, I think this year we have a fuller and more developed program than ever, and we're very excited, particularly about this conversation. It brings us to a very timely and critical discussion on the theme abolition, protest, and faith at a time when our country is so divided. It's important that we have conversations about how to push our whole society in a way that ends the systemic injustices that have plagued us for far too long, since the start of our nation, and to have those discussions about how do we create the just world that we want to see. Of course, these are conversations that have made Union in its almost 200-year history come back time and again to that place where our theological work meets the needs and the pressures and the issues of the world in which we find ourselves. And as always, it's not just about talking about it, but it's focusing on what might be some concrete steps to implement necessary changes. In bringing together this transgenerational group of alums and students, all of whom are engaged in abolitionist work, it's another moment in our history of academics where we bring together faith leaders and activists doing the work of justice. We're really happy today to have with us as the moderator of this discussion, a guy from right across the street from us, the Reverend Michael Livingston, who is the interim senior minister at the Riverside Church, another institution that we have long partnered with and shares our long.
The direction of Gary Dorian. His dissertation will investigate social ecology of extralegal violence against African Americans between emancipation and World War I. He's presented recently dealing with reparations and the American evasion of responsibility, as well as on the concept of freedom and structure of spiritual relations to social justice and world creativity in the thought and practice of Afro-American creative musicians since 1965. Craig Keel is a Union student from 1967, not a graduate. He attended and left for some very important reasons. A member of the resistance, the Union resistance against the war in Vietnam in 67 and 68, and then a long, distinguished career in the U.S. Foreign Service, followed by some additional assignments. And he retired with the rank of Consul General from the Foreign Service. He's a longtime member of Judson Memorial Church and has been a volunteer with the New Sanctuary Coalition and other nonprofits. Jane Lucas is a graduate of Union in 1969 with a joint Masters of Religion and Psychology with Columbia. She taught high school for a time and then did doctoral work in applied social psychology at NYU, a program that focused on facilitating social change. She's been designing global programs in child health and development for over 30 years, mainly with the World Health Organization and UNICEF. Currently, she advises international agencies and national programs on ways to integrate support for early childhood development into health, nutrition, education, and child protection services. And then finally, Rabbi Hilly Haber, Director of Social Justice Organizing for Central Synagogue. Hilly's also a PhD student at Union in Social Ethics, working as for Jermaine under the direction of Dr. Gary Dorian. He's also a chaplain at Northern State Prison in New Jersey and a former teacher on Rikers Island. Her work, and we've been saying her work at Central Synagogue focuses on faith-based criminal justice reform. Hilly, forgive me for that. So let's dive into this conversation with that introduction to our panelists. So I want to ask first to Craig and Jane, how do you see yourself in your own context? And if you could look back at yourself in 1967 and 1969, at the activism, at the issues that you were involved in, what would you tell yourself if you could go back in time? What does today have to say about yesterday? How does what you see now inform your own experience at the time? You'll have to unmute yourself.
That was because a siren went by. So we're in New York City. I came to Union from Minnesota. I had grown up on a farm in Minnesota. I didn't know much about social action, except that, what you run into in a small town. I went to Macalester College before coming to Union, and began to get more aware in my college life. But when I arrived at Union, I really came to study religion and psychology. I was struck very soon, though, by experiences at Union that introduced me to social problems within the city. Union was a perfect setting for that. And it seems to me that I tended to see the things right in front of me. So we were fighting the war, so we had demonstrations, which meant we were also fighting Columbia University in those demonstrations. The second year, we were working on reparations and what was happening with James Foreman, but in the context of something that was right in front of us. In that case, it was the building of a gymnasium by Columbia University in the park, and the community was ignored and not included in that gymnasium, even though we were taking space from the park. So we tended to feel directly challenged by these things, but did not understand the depths underneath of what Jermaine has been telling us about. We really had we had a general history of slavery. We talked about reparations mainly in terms of college scholarships. That was our notion of reparations. But we did not have what's come out now in recent times, where we're challenged by Black Lives Matter, by the killing of police. And that happened at Union for me. Afterwards, I did work in a prison for some time, and I learned, I was setting up services for psychology needs, and learned that mainly people in prison that were Black were there because they had mental health problems. Many, many of them did. So, we need to get into this period to help us understand why are they in prison, what else can we do? And I think that begins to tie a lot of things together at Union about how you're addressing, once again, the challenge of these problems from a broader, deeper manner than we ever did. That's mine.
I'm going to be more superficial. I followed the same path as Jane, except just substitute Iowa for Minnesota. When I got to New York, I was naive. I did not know what was going on in any sense. I didn't know how to handle the press. And one of the goals of union resistance was to get some publicity for our movement. And Union resistance was really just a branch of the larger resistance movement. Our goal was not to participate in the draft and shut it down with the longer goal of ending the war in Vietnam. Obviously, we were naive. We thought we could maybe do it if we could simply convince enough working class black and white kids to refuse the draft, then the war would grind to a halt. That sounds really naive now. It was only slightly less naive at the time. We were not born organizers. We were not good organizers. We never figured out how to organize. And so the thing I would tell myself now is pay more attention to what other successful people are doing and do what they do. Find a good model.
Mhm. I hear you talking about this framed primarily, both if you're not exclusively, but primarily around anti-war protests. But was there any consciousness at Union at the time of the Black Power and the kinds of struggles that were going on in the Black community? And the Civil Rights Movement wasn't over, but certainly that was very much alive and was morphing into something more powerful, different in ways, different manifestations, if not necessarily more powerful, but certainly a different manifestation. Were you aware of this? Was Union talking about this kind of thing? Was there even a significant presence of students of color on the campus?
The second year in particular, there was Black Power came to Union and led us and others connected with Columbia University and beyond the campus to the Black Power movement. But it was quite, I mean, I just realized that, we knew so little. James Cone came in the second year, I think the spring of the second year, to be a student, but he brought with him his Black theology, Black liberation theology. And we started talking about that, which was a meaningful discussion for those of us who are studying religion. But it didn't hit us in the same way. Black Lives Matter takes us over. And, it is a movement that I have tremendous hope for because of, so many reasons. But we were so weak in those areas when we were at Union.
In my case, all of these things happened after I left. The only thing I can say that was remotely related is that Martin Luther King came to campus while I was there. He'd also come to my college campus and gave a very inspiring speech. I mean, his speech, the speech that he gives, but it was truly inspiring. And unfortunately, I never acted on that. I was more focused on the war.
Mm-hmm. So to Jermaine and Hilly, as you hear Jane and Craig, do you feel like you're in this continuum, or are they talking about something that's different in some significant ways? The terms now are certainly very different. We're talking about abolition. If you say that to someone in my generation and we think slavery, we think we're having a discussion about history, but it means something very different today. So as you listen to what they've said, do you see yourselves as in this a continuum that's of substance pretty much the same, or are we talking about some very different issues and different perspectives and different approaches and even outcomes for the activism in which you're both engaged? Hilly, you want to try that first?
I was going to ask Jermaine if he wanted to start.
After you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, by the way. This is already a wonderful conversation. I do see our work as related. I think that especially, I mean, obviously we have this kind of connection through union, and union pushes us to think about the ways in which faith and academia meet to fight for justice. And so I am, today I kind of see that fight, I think, as we're saying, especially focused on this long and violent history of racism in America. And I think there's a connection with a threat of violence that runs through the work that we've all done. My work now focuses on mass incarceration and the ways in which mass incarceration and the whole criminal legal system has kind of continued to legalize segregation and discrimination in this country. So I do see a connective thread, and I also think that through our union connection and working from our sacred texts, we know there is a divine kind of moral blueprint for our universe and our role as faith leaders in wherever tradition we come from, and in whatever work we're doing, is to shout about the inconsistencies that we see in the world around us as we look and hold up that divine moral blueprint.
Jermaine?
I would certainly echo what Hilly just so adequately articulated. And, I would add that I see a lot more continuity than contradiction in these two generations of protest at Union. American history, as we know, is not so long that anything is really that ancient. And so the abolitionist tradition that began in the lead up to the Civil War, I think, is still very much with us on multiple levels. And the activism and the scholarship that Jane and Craig have engaged in reminds me that, in a sense, they're at kind of a middle point between the original abolitionist movement and the continuities that we have with the abolitionist movements that are taking place right now. And despite the fact that, we have terms like abolish the police and other ways of putting what we're doing that sound very, maybe extreme to some people and perhaps not extreme enough to others, I think there's a great deal of continuity that an institution like Union Theological Seminary is stable and durable enough to become a place where different constituencies across time can intersect and explore the different opportunities for networking with human beings, for engaging in scholarship that will allow people to then take a look at the challenges that are left over from the Civil War, really, and imagine more creative ways to work across ethnic groups, across class lines, and even across various ideologies to see what can be done through scholarship and through other ways of engaging. So I'm excited to actually see the opportunity not to focus on the contrasts in an unconstructive way, but to really imagine in a fresh way what creativity looks like between spirituality and politics and activism.
Mm-hmm. So let's turn to abolition and defund the police. On my way home prior to the beginning of this conversation, I heard Raphael Warnock's Republican opponent accuse him of wanting to defund the police. He wants to take away the police. He wants to abolish the police and make our communities unsafe for decent folks. It's a polarizing concept that's very difficult for people to understand. So let's talk about this from the perspective of these two generations. When you hear that, Jane or Craig, when you hear defund the police, abolition, let's get rid of the police, what does that strike in you? And can you make sense of it as a strategy that is useful in the work that has to be done by activists today?
I understand it, and I go back, and I'm not a historian, but I go back on the great societal accomplishments of the 20th century and so far in the 21st century. The New Deal, the WPA, the CCC, let's see, I made a list here. Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Obamacare, the building of the interstate highway system. Every one of those things would not have been possible without elected officials taking the mantle and forging compromises. And my fear is that if you don't keep that in mind, if we don't keep that in mind the entire time, that we will alienate enough of the population that the people we want to get elected who could make these compromises and move the ball forward will not get elected. So I don't think you can do anything without keeping the electorate in mind. That's my main concern. And I think that kind of thinking about messaging is very important. When I say you, I should say we, but.
Jane, you want to comment on that?
What gives me hope are some of the recent events where I think wide swaths of people have changed because of what we have seen and how they can be used to really bring people together to move it forward. I think that it is true to say defund the police will not work for now, but it always takes us something that taught us that the police are off track. And therefore, we have to reimagine what that means to take care of a community, provide safety, provide health services and mental health, to watch over the children in the playgrounds, to have a notion of what that would be. We now know we have to do something. Now, it won't be all people, but maybe there's a strong enough group. I truly, maybe I'm agreeing with Hilly. I see that we're moving forward. Faith gives us a reason to say there is hope. And when you pair faith with these particular current actions, events, there is an opportunity for that hope, to go forward. I know that sounds very blah, blah, but anyway, it's a part of what I'm seeing going on now that we did not have before.
The police are off track. Interesting way of putting it. You got a visceral reaction from me on that one. Let's go to you, Jermaine. So you got to tone it down, brother. This is too radical. We're not going to be able to bring the masses along if you use incendiary language like that. So back off. Come on. What do you say? What do you say to that?
Well, I think there are at least two necessary ways to think of it. And on one hand, defund the police is a hyperbolic way for some people to talk about a community refund, by which some folks mean we need to shift resources from the police department to other organizations who can better handle things that police obviously handle very poorly. And so there's that sense of the concept of defund the police that is maybe the wrong slogan for people who are actually interested in merely transferring resources. At the same time, there are those who say defund the police because they absolutely want the police to be defunded yesterday. And they want instead to put in place completely different alternative ways of administering community care. And looking for literature from the latter group that explains exactly what the nuts and bolts are of how to do that in a practical way has been, at least for me, a bit of a wild goose chase, because we'll just say that's a form of thought that's still in the process of becoming solid. But at the same time, it's difficult to think of the police in the United States as being off track. It's probably, I'd be curious to hear what Craig thinks, but it's probably more accurate to say that the police are on track. The police in the United States originally were tasked with controlling Indians and facilitating Indian removal, catching slaves, and after emancipation, making sure that you take freed people as quickly as possible back into a situation where their bodies and their labor is as lucrative as possible for plantation owners and large manufacturers. And so I do think, in a sense, that the violence from the police that we see is business as usual. At the same time, though, I would emphasize that when we think about the role of an institution like Union Theological Seminary, it's important to realize that union can play a very important role in helping people understand what is most important for an institution like union to understand, which is that the police, as well as the prison industrial complex, is an inhumane, these are inhumane practices and inhumane institutions. And if we focus, as Joy James continuously reminds us as a political scientist, that our focus should be on those who are suffering at the hands of the police and those who are suffering the most from mass incarceration, so that it becomes clear to us and remains clear to us that the human rights violations should be at the fore, and relieving that pain is important, but also dismantling the institutions that are working smoothly, I think is very important. And just lastly, I'll say very quickly, even though we hear a lot of incendiary rhetoric about abolishing the police, I think it's also important to remember that if you're really concerned by what happened to Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and also with George Floyd, then we have to think of this concept of defund the police in a way that is in continuity with their lives, and in a way that represents our relationship to the communities that brought up Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd, and not use them merely as an excuse to go off on a tangent that might be appropriate or interesting for ancillary or unrelated communities.
Hilly, would you like to add to this? And then we'll get a response from Craig and Jane on that.
I just to echo Jermaine, I do think historically the police forces across the country, who are militarized forces, are working exactly as they have been throughout American history. But I'll also add kind of on this idea of union's role and the role of a theological imagination in approaching this discussion. I think if we look just specifically at New York City and where have we gone wrong, or what is happening with our police force? I think if you look at Rikers Island and who's on Rikers Island is a very good indication of what's happening. People who are housing insecure are on Rikers Island. People who are going through mental health crisis are on Rikers Island. People with substance abuse problems are on Rikers Island. There is, women who have been abused are on Rikers Island. I mean, there's no, and this is who is being arrested. This is who is being sent to Rikers Island. And there is just I think that the idea of moving resources around, defunding police and refunding communities that have been harmed by the police historically, but also just to put programs in place that are helping people who are going through all these different kinds of trauma and crisis in their lives, so they don't end up on Rikers Island, which is not equipped to handle any of to handle these kinds of needs, and also is a place of torture. And so I do think if we just look there, and I think our faith, and it calls us with this idea of theological imagination. Oftentimes in New York State, when we talk about any kind of criminal justice reform, we get this backlash on the idea of public safety. What about public safety? How do we keep everyone safe if we're going to defund the police, or if we're going to decarcerate? And I think this moment always, but especially now, just calls us to reimagine public safety. I mean, no one is safe who is on Rikers Island. Our city is not a safe place when someone who's having mental health crisis is being arrested. So I think we just need to kind of think together. What does it mean to be safe? What does it mean to create safe communities? And how do we do that as a city in this call to public safety?
Jane, Craig, any?
Well, Rikers Island is certainly a scandal, and I would love to see it closed. I would love to see, unfair bail provisions eliminated. And I know that there's been some progress, but there's so much to do in that regard. And Jermaine's arguments are very sympathetic as well for me. I just think that there will always be police, because I don't see how we can convince the public to completely eliminate a police force with uniforms. It will never be like England, I'm afraid. But what the police need is real effective training and accountability. I think accountability is the most important thing, because we can see that when a police officer does something that's against the rule book or is unjust, they're very rarely punished. And that is simply has to be fixed.
Anything, Jane?
I can't disagree with anything that's been said, not a single thing. Um, and it just reminds me of the role of union in all this. We used to depend on sitting someplace together in the lounge and have these discussions long into the night with our professors. The rich environment that was possible then before COVID was truly something that we could build on, and I hope that there's another way to do it. I am for the concept of defunding police, but not getting rid of police. So, I mean, I do think that the communities that are sometimes hardest hit by crime are the ones that need a whole different concept of the police presence, but they need police. And so this is a very complicated thing. And I think that a place like Union brings together a lot of resources in the academic world and practice in the real world, that this is something to take on. This could be perhaps a continuing discussion around which the Bible, social justice, worship could bring a fresh look and find ways that we could bring people together around it.
I'm going to take a question out of the Q&A in just a moment, but let me just mention, and I'm sorry I don't have the article with me. I saw it this morning, but there's a couple in Midwest somewhere, I think maybe even the upper West, Northwest. They lost a case asking to be remunerated for the damage to their home after the police response to a homeless man who was seen entering their house. What was the response? There were 55 vehicles that descended upon this house. They broke most of the windows in the house. They tear gassed the house. There were 2 helicopters deployed after this homeless man, who it turns out took a glass of milk and some cookies out of the refrigerator. This raises the question of how the police do their work.
Yep.
Something that's a lot more. And if you don't raise the question, if you don't say defund the police, if you don't talk about abolition, you don't move the needle anywhere near where it needs to go in order to make the kinds of changes that are happening. So let me take one of these questions. Serene asks, can you talk about the reparations fund that was created around 1969? It was $1 million asked for by the Black Power movement in Harlem in the form of a community fund. Do you know anything about this? Anybody want to address this question?
I'm not sure if that specific one is that the James Foreman one.
I think we need Jermaine saying yes.
I believe so.
Yeah, that was really struggled with in Union. I remember we had a meeting in the chapel that went probably all night practically on how we were going to respond. And there was discussion about defunding Union to give money to that fund. There was discussion about, at the time, the scariest piece was we would have to destroy the library, Brook Library, and because it was representative of all the things that were from the Western culture that was fighting and repressing other cultures. And so this came that far, and I don't know, then we left Union, and I don't know whether Union gave any of its scholarship funds or other pieces of it to the Foreman Fund. Maybe
Uh,
Serene knows. I don't know.
Serene or Hilly or Serene, I'd be happy to have you come back in, Serene, if you want to address that. Jermaine?
As far as I'm aware, Foreman's demand was that that money be given to the BEDC. I don't actually know the full name of that that acronym, but the union community, as far as I understand, saw fit to give that money to other entities so that it would be dispersed in a different way. But I was really impressed searching through the Burke archives to find that a diverse coalition of union students actually responded to Foreman's demand at Riverside by occupying the administrative offices in order to encourage a response. And I think it's noteworthy that even though the union community saw fit to reimagine how they would respond to Foreman, as someone who's very invested in reparations as a reality, it was helpful to see that union has a tradition of people responding in the affirmative to an idea of reparations, although Foreman's idea is pretty far, I think, from an adequate one.
Serene, would you like to comment on your own question? Okay, Serene may not be with us at the moment. Let's go on. Here's a question that harkens back to the discussion. Oh, there you are. Okay.
Yes, no, Jermaine answered the question quite well. I just wanted, it's a part of union's history that it is not well known, and it goes back to the fact that the reparations conversation here has been going on for a long time, and I know that many seminaries are just now starting to talk about it, and it's only limited to scholarship discussions. I know that the articles I've read, again, I haven't heard the full story, but that it was actually not scholarship support, but actual community funds that were given. So not to say it was a perfect move, but way before most of theological education was talking about reparations, union actually took very seriously, and the Board of Trustees took out of the endowment $1 million to do this. So I think it's worth remembering that and building on that history.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the critical matter. Yes, you did it in the past. The question is always, what are we doing in the present? How do we continue to build on something that at that time would have been a good response to a felt need and a historical travesty. So here's a question for Jermaine and Hilly, and it goes back to the issue of defunding the police. There is this spectrum. We've seen it reflected in this conversation. Folks who say and mean defund the police, abolish the police, and others who think we're never going to, we don't want to live in a society where there isn't an organized force such as the police. How do you have constructive conversations? The point of the question that's in our chat. How do we engage people who are so opposed, who are on the other end of that spectrum from where you are? Hilly, would you be willing to take the lead on that?
Sure. Thank you. I think it's an interesting conversation, and I think a faith community is a really important place to be having that conversation, because it is a place, as we said, where people from with different political leanings and ideologies can kind of come together in service of something greater than themselves and their ideologies, and really have conversation. And so I think to do this, I mean, at Central, I'll just say specifically, we really kind of rely on the stories of people with lived experience, and to kind of use those stories as ways of introducing questions of defunding the police and mass incarceration, not just as theoretical ideas and things people might read about in the newspaper, but actual stories where to show kind of, these are the lived experience of people has to be kind of the leader in this conversation, and to kind of use the methodology of liberation theology, that our ethical and theological knowledge on these conversations has to come from people who have these experiences. So that's just, it's one way that we have begun to have this conversation within the Central community.
I think I would have to start by saying we have to understand the history of law enforcement in the United States as something of an anomaly. And the reason why I say something of an anomaly is because it's very counterproductive to imagine that nothing different in the future can happen that is different than what has happened in the past. And our idea of policing and our idea of security has been formed in a colonial context of genocide, and in a colonial context of slavery and post-slavery paranoia, so to speak. So if we really think about what our history of policing is, and to see it for what it is, I think we should be inspired to hope and to research in such a way that we can build other forms of living together as community that are actually worthy of all the energy that it takes to live a human life. And I think of, as people of faith, as humanists, as spiritual people, we have no excuse to think the future can only be some, rendition of the past. I would also say, however, that it's very important, again, to focus on the communities that have the worst possible relationship with the police, and to collaborate with those individuals, or with individuals from those communities. And so I continue to think about some groups that I know who consider themselves to be very radical, and their ideas about community security never intersect with someone like Breonna Taylor or George Floyd, but instead they have a different idea that might be related to anarchism and some other forms of thought that might make Breonna Taylor and George Floyd scratch their heads. And so at the same time, I would also insist that people like those of us who are associated with Union Theological Seminary understand our class position and realize that many of us are among the least vulnerable to the worst that the worst policing has to offer. But we can also be a very important part of this process by which we do the very difficult, technical, creative, and imaginative work of saying the past is and was a problem, and we have the capacity as human beings to reimagine something totally different. And then, of course, we have to figure out what does it mean then to engage with one another politically, so that we can actually persuade one another that change is necessary, and persuade one another that change is possible. And I think, I echo in that sense with what Craig said, is that sometimes we should probably think of slogans to describe what we're doing that reflect the reality that we actually want to see come about. And I think thinking carefully about language, thinking carefully about who needs to be convinced of what is important, so that we can be constructive, even as we imagine the most bold and radical futures.
I'll just, if I could just add on too, right? Reverend Livingston, the story you told about the police force in the Northwest, and the kind of that sounded like a police force that was at war with the community, and that sounded like a military invasion. And you asked earlier about the connective thread between the work of Jane and Craig and Abolition Today, and that that kind of violence and that the anti-war movement. I think to see those two things coming together in this work, to recognize that military forces and wars are not just on foreign soil, but there are communities at war right now with police, and the police are a militarized force in those cities. And so just to kind of draw that connection, I think speaks in a way to Jermaine's call about this kind of the power of that kind of theological imagination, and just how we are having this conversation.
This will take us in a slightly different direction, but also a question from the Q&A. Would love to hear more about, I'm sorry, not that one, the one I want to do now is, could one of the panelists speak to Union's role in the 19th century abolition movement and any present day lessons to be drawn from it? I'm not sure who that would be, but Hilly or Jermaine, Jane or Craig?
I'll say that I'm still in the process of finding out exactly what contributed to Union's non-response. But it's my understanding, and I'll put this at my advisor's feet. Professor Gary Dorian, has recently addressed class and has said that Union did not take a leading role in the abolitionist movement of the 19th century. And one of the things that he reminds us of all the time is that abolitionists were not considered to be great people by the so-called civil society at the time. But abolitionists were, among other things, people who were violating the sacred rights of property ownership. And so when I think about the fact that Union did not take a leading role or a brave role in the abolitionist movement in the 19th century, I have all kinds of strong and negative feelings about that. But on a more constructive side, it does make me wonder what were the social relationships that held, this institution together at that time, such that it was more important to maintain perhaps a status quo. And what kind of status quo are we wrapped up in the 21st century that is getting in the way of us taking a revolutionary role in abolitionist thinking, in the current time period?
Here's a question that's for Jane and Craig. It's described as a chicken egg question. What inspired you to get involved in activism when you were at Union? Did you come to Union expecting to protest the war, or did you get involved in activism as a result of your experience at Union?
Well, I did register for the draft as a conscientious objector, but that was before I'd heard of the Vietnam War. It was 1962, so the Vietnam War had not yet really begun. And so I had pacifist inclinations at the time, but my objection to the Vietnam War was generated rather than on a pacifist basis. It was on a simple evaluation of what harm the war was doing, not only to our country, but also to the Vietnamese and that peninsula. And so I had a very pragmatic approach, and I think a lot of people at Union went at it from the same perspective, that we were not moralizing about the war. We just thought it was a bad idea and ethically wrong.
When I came to Union, as I said before, I did not come for activism. But unions, as a social psychologist, I think of the forces around you shape your behavior in a big way. Union deliberately put us into various situations. So my internship was with St. Mary's Church in Manhattanville. I mean, who thought to put me in that place? Except they probably thought they had to get me in a place where I'd be shaken up and be confronted by real life in a Black community. And so Union had a way of doing that. Union puts you into small groups studying something, and you had to come up with a paper that dealt with an issue. It was a deliberate, intentional way of training you, and took not just me, everybody around me, from where we were when we came in, far into the direction of social action.
While this question was directed to Jane and Craig, I suspect that for today's activists, students at Union, it's a different kind of proposition. You know what Union is, you know who's teaching there, you come because you want to be engaged in these areas. You want your learning to be shaped by the kinds of thinkers and even the tradition of the school in its more recent history anyway. Would that be the case, or is it something else? What would you say to that? Hilly, Jermaine? It's got to be one of you. Or both of you.
Yeah, that I could start us. That is the case for me. I saw Union really as the place where justice, faith, and academia meet. And I came to study with Dr. Dorian and really to focus in on this history of abolition and specifically extra legal violence against Black and Brown communities in the United States. And I see that kind of is my role as a rabbi, as a Reform rabbi. In we have the same story in our Jewish communities of kind of looking down at abolitionists and trying to kind of maintain what was kind of this civil society. And I'm here to kind of figure out where Reform rabbis and rabbinic voices have come down on this question and where our tradition has failed to speak out and failed to really make change and what has gotten in our way. So I came to Union really specifically to study these things and to learn from people like Jermaine, who I have been, who is kind of my model going through this PhD process, leading the way for me.
Oh, wow. Thanks for the vote of confidence, Hilly. I hope I can at least do one useful thing while I'm here. But I would also add, before coming to Union, I had just gotten over the fact that most institutions actually are not radical. And there's something about lasting for a long period of time and having any measure of stability that somewhat negates what I would consider to be radical. And that's actually part of what attracted me to Union, because I realized that Union is a place where you're not necessarily going to be fed radicality, if I could use that word, but it's a place where you can actually develop your own concepts and your own constructs and thought, and have access to world-class intellectuals who are present in order to make it possible and to provide those resources. And so I have, and some of my colleagues have found themselves sort of negotiating the distinction between having the capacity to develop your skills that you can apply to radical work versus holding an institution responsible for being some definition of radical that might be a bit arbitrary. But I think Union continues to be in a perfect position in more than one way to actually nourish faith and compassion and social justice commitments in students who are looking for an opportunity to develop what really is unique inside of themselves, so that then you have the skills and some of the social network necessary to then do those things that you're called to do without needing the institution to necessarily be something that most institutions in America don't last very long trying to be.
Jermaine, we're going to keep you talking with this next question, which is from someone who would love to hear more about your research on alternative forms of community care.
Oh my goodness. So I've used the term alternative forms of community care as a way to describe what I hear other people talking about when they want to know what can we do besides the police, what can we have besides prisons. One of the things that it's sort of like my secondary research project that I'll have to pick up more certainly after I do my dissertation. But I'm thinking a lot nowadays about politics and spirituality as a relationship within human beings and between communities that's a form of world creativity. And since in the United States of America, we have a diverse number of people, a group of people with all sorts of ideologies, and there's never been one ideology in America that completely displaced all others. Part of what I'm realizing in terms of community care and creativity is the fact that there has to be some way outside of extremes, but also in the midst of extremes, for different generations, people with different ideologies and across so-called racial and ethnic lines to make a decision about the kind of life that we want to have together. And it's this sense of togetherness that for me requires creativity, because this is of course a nation of ethnicities, if you will. Not quite a melting pot, but a nation of distinct ethnicities. And in order to figure out what does it mean for these distinct groups to collaborate together, to figure out viable forms of life where we all intersect, I think that means we actually have to politicize the concept of care and take care as seriously as possible, because it's one of the most distinctly human things that we can possibly do. And in my research on extralegal violence after the emancipation, one of the things that I'm realizing is that it was necessary to create ideologies that made common sense human expressions of care seem as if they were beyond the pale, so that if you thought lynching was a bad idea and you dared to publish your opinion about it in the newspaper, for example, there were forces both within liberal circles, Southern business circles, all throughout the country that would emphasize your form of caring is a kind of extreme philanthropy that actually has no place in the practical everyday aspects of life. And so I'm realizing this concept of care is something that human beings do better than, I'm assuming, better than any other entities on the planet. But yet we have to really think about, why are we programmed not to care unless we see a gruesome video of a police killing? Why are we programmed not to care as long as we're not the ones incarcerated and put into detention centers and isolated? So I think it's very important to actually take care out of the margins of public life and bring it to the center as a form of creativity, spirituality, and politics that requires all of the technical and economic resources that we can muster.
Beautifully said. Yeah, I understand we're 15 minutes past our finishing time, which clearly demonstrates that the time was inadequate for these subjects and for the experiences and expertise of the people who've been engaging in this conversation. Let me just say there was one other comment, really. It wasn't a question that we didn't get to, that I think it makes sense to close on, just to put it out there for our consideration. It was from someone writing about the county in which he lives, voting 70% for Trump. And this reality of the divide that's present now. What is it now? 72 million people voted for Donald Trump. His behavior, his leadership, and the policies he's enacted, the things he's contemplating right now, seeming to have no effect on millions of people in our society. And if there's any community charged with addressing these kinds of realities in our society, it's a faith community. It's folks like yourselves who have been engaged and are engaged in activism that's faith-based and that is aimed at transforming our society according to the values that we encounter and come so alive for us in the gospel. And that's what you all represent. And it's been a pleasure to hear you all reflect on these questions. And I want to thank you for your participation. I want to assume that someone's going to follow me and wrap this up, but I personally have benefited from all of your contributions to this. And I thank you for Jane and Craig, what you have done for many, many years and are still continuing to do. And Jermaine and Hilly for this really important work that you're doing, even as you prepare for even more effective ways of contributing to the transformation of our society. So thank you all, and I'm going to turn this over to Serene or someone.
So back in here. So all I need to do is once again say thank you for this conversation. Thank you for all the people who are participating. And what this conversation makes clear is that there's many more conversations needed, but not just conversations, real concrete plans for action. So we can continue even in this extremely divided time to move the needle in the right direction, or I should say, not the right direction, but the left direction. That the issues are serious and lives hang in the breeze of this. And I'm very grateful for this, for your research. Good luck with the dissertation, Hilly. Good luck with getting to that point. And Jane and Craig, thank you so much for bringing Union's past into the present with your presence here and all the work you've done for these many years. So thank you all, and more to come. Thank you, Michael, too, for moderating.
Thank you all.
Thank you for including us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are we